There are moments in life that you can't explain, moments where you know something is wrong before your brain has even caught up to your eyes. That was the day I saw her. I wasn't supposed to be there. Nobody was. The Velari processing station on the edge of Sector 9 was off-limits to civilian observers. That's what they called us, civilians, like we were a lower category of existence, and not the people who'd built half the infrastructure they were now occupying. But I had a maintenance clearance badge from my old job at the thermal relay station, and the Velari enforcers weren't exactly known for checking credentials carefully. They assumed anyone moving through their checkpoints with purpose was supposed to be there. That's a human trick, by the way. Walk like you belong somewhere, and people believe you do. I walked like I belonged, and so I saw her. Let me back up a little, because you need to understand the world as it was before I tell you about the world as it became. The Velari arrived 11 years before this story begins. That's what people always want to know first. When did they come, and did we fight back? The answer to the first question is 11 years. The answer to the second question is yes, and it didn't matter even slightly. Not because we were cowardly. Not because our weapons were primitive, though they were, compared to what the Velari brought with them. We fought because that's what humans do. We fight even when fighting is suicidal. We fight even when the math is completely against us. There's something in the human genome that looks at impossible odds and gets angry instead of scared. The Velari didn't understand that about us at first. By the time they did, it was too late for them to matter to the war, because the war was already over. They came in ships the size of small moons. That's not hyperbole. I've seen the footage. 7 vessels, each one roughly the diameter of a city, hanging in the sky like metal planets that had decided to come see what all the fuss was about down here. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't broadcast demands or ultimatums. They simply arrived, one morning, global, simultaneous, and within 48 hours they had disabled every satellite, every long-range communication array, every military installation that used anything more sophisticated than a campfire for power. Then they sent the translation drones. Small things, the drones, about the size of a soccer ball, chrome and featureless, hovering at about shoulder height. Millions of them dropping into every city simultaneously, and they spoke. In every language, in every dialect, in perfectly calibrated local accent, they spoke. Your planet is now under the administrative authority of the Velari Collective. Resistance is inadvisable. Cooperation is expected. Your biological forms will be preserved. Your cultural artifacts will be cataloged. Your species will continue to exist under the terms of Velari governance. We are not your enemies. We are your administrators. Administrators. That's what they called themselves. Not conquerors. Not overlords. Administrators. Like they'd just taken over the management of a building, and we were the tenants who needed to understand the new rules about noise after 10 p.m. The condescension of it was almost beautiful in how complete it was. I should tell you what the Velari looked like, because it matters to the story. They were tall, most of them between 7 and 8 feet, with narrow bodies that seemed wrong in the way that very thin trees seem wrong during a windstorm, like they shouldn't be standing upright but somehow are. Their skin ranged from deep slate gray to kind of matte blue-black, and it had a faint texture to it, almost like brushed metal, though it moved and flexed like flesh. Their heads were elongated. Their eyes were wide-set and bioluminescent. They glowed a dim amber color in low light, which made them look perpetually like something seen through night vision. They had 4 arms, all of them long, jointed twice where a human arm joints once, ending in 7-fingered hands that moved with a precision that was slightly unsettling to watch. Their faces were almost expressionless by human standards. Not because they didn't have emotions, they did, we learned that eventually, but because they expressed those emotions in frequencies of light and subtle color shifts in their skin, rather than in the movement of their features. A Velthari who was amused would have a barely perceptible warm shimmer along their jawline. One who was angry would darken at the temples. One who was frightened, though this was rare, would go almost completely pale, a kind of chalky grayish-white that was striking against their normal coloring. They found human facial expression baffling and slightly disturbing. They found human voices too loud. They found human body language chaotic and difficult to parse. They found human persistence genuinely alarming. We just kept showing up. We kept resisting in small ways. We kept rebuilding things they shut down. We kept finding workarounds. We kept existing in ways they hadn't accounted for in their administrative models. And slowly, over the 11 years since their arrival, a kind of grudging stalemate had developed. Not peace, not rebellion, just this uncomfortable coexistence where they ran the major infrastructure and the official bureaucracy. And we ran everything underneath that. All the informal networks and community systems and small economies that kept actual human life functioning. They needed us to function. We needed them to not actively destroy us. It wasn't a good arrangement, but it was the arrangement we had. And then there was the girl. Her name was Mara Voss. I didn't know her name when I first saw her. I just saw a human girl in a Velthari holding cell, and something about the way she sat absolutely still, spine straight, hands flat on her knees, eyes fixed on the wall in front of her with an expression I can only describe as patient fury, made me stop walking. I shouldn't have stopped. Stopping draws attention, and attention in a Velthari processing station was the last thing I needed, but I stopped anyway. She was maybe 23, 24. Dark hair cut short on the sides, longer on top, pushed back from her face in a way that looked like she hadn't bothered with it rather than like she'd styled it. She was wearing the gray processing coverall they gave to detainees, a shapeless thing, too large for her frame, with the Velthari administrative code printed on the back in that angular script of theirs. She had a bruise along her left cheekbone that was 4 or 5 days old, gone yellow-green at the edges. She had a cut above her right eyebrow that had been treated with the chemical sealant the Velthari used instead of stitches. It left a faint metallic sheen over the wound. She'd been through something. But the thing that stopped me, the thing that made me stand there like an idiot in the middle of a corridor in a facility I wasn't supposed to be in, was her eyes. She wasn't looking at the wall. I'd thought she was, from the angle of her head. But as I stood there, I realized she wasn't looking at anything in the physical sense. Her gaze was turned inward. She was looking at something inside herself. And her expression, that patient fury, was not directed at the cell or the Velthari or even her situation. She was directing it inward too. Like she was angry at herself. Like she was trying to force something to happen through sheer concentrated will. Like she was sitting in that cell with absolute deliberate stillness, because movement was a distraction from whatever she was trying to make her own mind do. I'd been walking past that cell for approximately 4 seconds. I know because I counted later, replaying it. In those 4 seconds, I noticed all of this. And I knew, the way you sometimes just know things, the way your gut speaks in a language your brain hasn't learned yet, that this girl was not going to be a prisoner for very much longer. I didn't know why I knew that, I just knew. I kept walking. I did my maintenance work, replaced 3 thermal couplings in the sub-level relay room, ran a diagnostic on the secondary power conduits, logged everything in the Velthari mandated maintenance system with my falsified credentials and the very real competence I'd spent 15 years developing. Then I walked back out through the same checkpoints, nodded at the same enforcers, and stepped out into the gray afternoon air of what used to be called Detroit. They didn't call it that anymore. The Velthari had designated it Administrative Zone 7, North American Landmass, Sector 9. But old habits, it was still Detroit to everyone who lived there. I sat in my vehicle, an older electric model, pre-Velthari, which I maintained obsessively, because I didn't trust the Velari network newer models. And I sat there for a long moment just breathing. Then I called Yusuf. Yusuf ran the network. That's all I'll say about that for now, because the network was the kind of thing where the less you knew about it in explicit terms, the less you could accidentally give away. But he ran it, and he was good at it, and when I told him what I'd seen, a human girl in a Velari processing station, held in a standard detention cell rather than transported to one of the administrative processing centers, which was unusual. He went quiet for a moment in a way that told me he already knew who she was. Mara Voss, he said. Who is she? Another pause, longer this time. She's the daughter of Dr. Elena Voss. That landed on me like cold water. Dr. Elena Voss, I knew that name. Everyone in certain circles knew that name. She'd been a theoretical physicist at the University of Michigan before the Velari arrived. One of the quiet, brilliant people who worked in obscure corners of particle physics and quantum field theory, and didn't make the news much because their work was too complicated to explain in headlines. After the arrival, she'd been recruited, or conscripted, depending on how you looked at it, into one of the Velari's scientific interface programs, where human researchers worked alongside Velari scientists to catalog and evaluate human scientific knowledge. She'd died 3 years ago. The official report said cardiac event. The unofficial network understood that she'd been working on something the Velari didn't want her working on, and that whatever it was, it had gotten her killed. Her daughter, I said. Her daughter, Yusuf confirmed. Elena's research. There's something specific about their family from what we've been able to piece together. Elena was running experiments before she died, not the official ones, the ones she was doing on her own time in her personal lab space. We don't know exactly what she found, but whatever it was, the Velari shut down her entire research archive within 6 hours of her death. Everything. Not just sealed, destroyed. We've never seen them do that before. I looked back at the facility entrance. 2 Velari enforcers standing at the external gate, their amber eyes scanning the street in slow sweeps. Unhurried. Confident. The way you're confident when you've never once in your life encountered something you couldn't control. And now they have the daughter, I said. Now they have the daughter, Yusuf agreed. Which means whatever Elena found, whatever she was working on, they think Mara has something to do with it. Does she? The longest pause yet. We don't know, he said. But I'll tell you what the network has been picking up over the last few weeks. The Velari have increased patrols in every sector where Mara has lived in the last 2 years. They've been monitoring her communications aggressively, not passively, for at least 8 months. They brought in a Class 4 interrogation specialist from the Velari home system, not a local administrator. Someone they shipped across space specifically for this. I let that sink in. A Class 4 interrogation specialist. The Velari had a tiered system for how they classified threats. Class 1 through 3 were handled locally. Class 4 meant the threat was considered significant enough to warrant resources from the home system, actual Velari resources, not the second-hand administrative infrastructure they maintained on occupied planets. They'd ship someone across space to interrogate a 20-something human girl. What are they so afraid she has? I asked. Yusuf's voice when it came was quieter than before, almost careful. We think Elena Voss figured out what the Velari have been hiding about humans since they arrived, about what we actually are, about what we can do. He paused, and we think she passed that knowledge to her daughter, not in words or data or anything they could intercept, in a different way. What does that mean? It means, Yusuf said, that you need to get back into that facility. I didn't go back that night. I went back 3 days later, because 3 days was enough time for me to set up the cover properly, new maintenance request, legitimate fault code in the relay system that I'd triggered myself from a remote access point. everything logged and timestamped in a way that would survive casual scrutiny. The Velthari were thorough administrators, but they were not, as it turned out, particularly imaginative. They assumed that humans who moved through their systems with the right credentials were doing what the credentials said they were doing. The idea that someone might falsify credentials, trigger a real technical fault, and then use the repair visit as cover for something else. It wasn't that they'd considered this and dismissed it. It was that the thought pattern itself required a kind of layered deceptive thinking that didn't come naturally to them. They were intelligent, they were not cunning. There's a difference. I walked back in 3 days later with a different badge, same clearance level, different name, which I could do because the Velthari facial recognition system had a known blind spot with certain lighting conditions in the maintenance corridor, and I'd spent 2 years learning exactly where those blind spots were, and I made my way down to sub-level 2 again. She was still there. Same cell, same posture, that unnerving stillness, spine straight, hands flat. The bruise on her cheek was fading but hadn't gone. They hadn't hurt her again, at least not visibly, but they hadn't released her either. 11 days in the cell. No processing, no formal charges in the Velthari administrative system that Yusuf's contacts had been able to find. Just held. Waiting. I slowed my pace as I passed, and this time I risked a direct look. She was already looking at me. Not at the corridor in general, at me specifically. Her eyes had snapped to me the moment I came around the corner with a precision that was startling, like a sensor locking onto a target. And her expression had shifted so subtly that I almost missed it, but I didn't miss it. The patient fury was still there, but underneath it now something else. She's measuring me, I thought. She's trying to figure out if I'm a problem or a resource. I kept walking, I had to. But I let my pace slow enough to be slightly odd, not suspicious, just slightly slower than the purposeful stride of a maintenance worker in a hurry. And as I passed her cell, I let my left hand drift close to the corridor wall, and I dragged my thumbnail across the metal in a specific pattern. Short, short, long, short, short, long. An old signaling code, pre-Velthari, from the early resistance days when the network was first forming, and people needed ways to communicate that weren't detectable by the alien monitoring systems that scanned for digital signals and radio frequencies, and the electromagnetic spectrum of essentially everything. But they didn't scan for scratched metal. They didn't understand why anyone would bother. Because it was a terrible communication method. Slow and limited and easily missed. Unless you were looking for it. I walked on, turned the corner, went to the relay room, replaced a coupling that didn't need replacing. Took my time. 45 minutes later, I walked back the same way. She was in exactly the same position. But as I passed, she moved her right hand, just the fingers, and scratched against the surface of the bench she was sitting on. Long, long, short, long, long, short. Received. I didn't let myself react. I kept walking, kept my breathing even, kept my face neutral. But my heart was doing something complicated in my chest. That evening I told Yusuf. She knows the code, he said, and there was something in his voice I hadn't heard before, something that might have been awe, or might have been fear, or might have been both of those things sitting right next to each other. We never taught that code to anyone outside the network in the last 4 years. And Alina Voss died before we established it. I thought about that. She could have encountered it from someone else. No, Yusuf said. The specific pattern you used, that's not the general network code. That's our localized variant specific to the Great Lakes region, created 18 months ago. There are maybe 40 people alive who know it. Silence. Then how did she know it? I asked. He didn't answer that directly. Instead, he said, what you need to know is this. The Velthari Class 4 interrogator, his name in their system is something we can't pronounce, but the network has been calling him the librarian because his speciality is extraction. He doesn't hurt people, he reads them. He has a technology. We've only encountered it twice before, both times with Velari targets, never human, called a resonance tap. It interfaces with the subject's neurobioelectrical field and pulls pattern-organized information. Memories. Specific memories. I felt cold. He's going to pull her memories. He's been trying, Yusuf said. For 11 days, from what we can gather from the energy readings our people have been monitoring near the facility. He's been trying and... He stopped. What? It's not working, Yusuf said. The resonance tap isn't working on her. She's not blocking it, she can't block it. It doesn't work that way. It's more like... He searched for the word. Like he's reaching for her and finding something that isn't organized the way he expects. Like her mind is arranged differently than any human or Velari mind he's worked on before. I thought about the girl in the cell, the absolute stillness, the inward focus, the patient fury directed at something inside herself. She's trying to force something to happen, I'd thought when I first saw her. Yusuf, I said slowly, what exactly did Elena Voss figure out about humans? He was quiet for a long moment. Then, are you familiar with the term latent biological architecture? I wasn't. It's a Velari scientific concept, he said. It refers to the idea that a species can have genetic or physiological structures that are present but non-functional, not vestigial, not evolutionary dead ends, but genuinely present and capable of function, just dormant, waiting for the right conditions or the right stimulus. He let that sit there. Elena Voss, he continued, spent the last 2 years of her life working on the theory that humans have latent biological architecture that the Velari recognized when they first conducted their biological surveys of Earth, that they've known about it since before they arrived, and that the reason they established administrative control rather than simply destroying or removing the human population, the reason they need us functional and present, is that they are waiting for it to activate. The cold I'd been feeling spread further. Waiting for what to activate? I asked, though part of me already felt the shape of the answer. We don't know, Yusuf said. Elena died before she could complete her documentation, but she believed, and this is the part the Velari are most afraid of, she believed that the activation wasn't supposed to happen naturally. She believed the Velari were planning to trigger it themselves, under controlled conditions, on their timeline, for their purposes. I stared at the wall of my apartment. In Mara, I asked. Yusuf's voice dropped very low. Elena Voss's research indicated that activation isn't species-wide, it's individual. Specific genetic and physiological conditions have to align, and she believed she'd identified the conditions in one person. He paused. Her daughter. The night after that conversation, I didn't sleep. I lay on my back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and tried to organize what I knew into something that made sense, and failed, and tried again. The Velari had come to Earth not to destroy us, but to manage us. They were waiting for something in the human genome to activate. Elena Voss had figured this out, and figured out that her daughter was the person in whom it would activate. And now the Velari had the daughter, and their best extraction specialist couldn't read her mind. And she was sitting in a cell doing something with her own interior landscape that had her so focused she barely moved. What was she trying to do? What had her mother told her? Not in words or data, Yusuf had said, in a different way. I thought about that until the gray light of morning started coming through my window. Then I made a decision. I went back to the facility the next day. No maintenance cover this time. I used a completely different identity and access path, a supply run for the administrative cafeteria on the upper level, which I'd arranged through a contact who worked in food services. Less time in the building, less flexibility, but it got me past the checkpoint. I took a different route through the sub-level corridors, one that passed near the holding cells from the opposite direction. I needed to see if they'd moved her, and I needed to see something else. I needed to see the Class 4 interrogator. I found him in a monitoring room adjacent to her cell block. Or rather, I found a Velari in a monitoring room adjacent to her cell block, and the way the other Velari in the room were oriented around him, the subtle physical deference, the slight angling of bodies, the careful stillness, told me he was significant. He was taller than most Velari I'd seen, almost 9 feet, I'd guess, which was unusual. His coloring was darker too, a near black with a faint iridescent quality in the fluorescent light, like the surface of deep water. He stood with his 4 arms configured in a particular way, 2 crossed at the lower set, 2 hanging loose at the upper, and he was watching a feed from Mara's cell with an expression that, on a human face, I would have read as frustrated. Frustrated and something else, something I struggled to name for a moment. Then I named it. Uncertain. The Class 4 interrogator, the specialist they'd shipped across space specifically for this, was uncertain. Whatever was happening with Mara Voss, whatever she was doing in that cell, sitting still and focused and furious with herself, it was doing something to him, something he hadn't expected, something he didn't have a framework for. I kept walking, delivered my supplies, left the building. That afternoon, I told Yusuf everything. "We need to get her out," I said, "before he figures out what's happening and escalates." "Agreed," Yusuf said, "but the extraction is complicated. She's in a deep holding block, Class 3 security infrastructure." "I know the infrastructure," I said. "I've been inside that building 4 times. I know which systems have gaps and which ones don't." A pause. "You're volunteering." "I'm the only one who knows the building well enough. You understand what you're risking." I thought about the girl in the cell, the patience and fury of her, the way she'd answered my signal without hesitation, without apparent surprise, with a precision that still made my skin prickle when I thought about it. "Yeah," I said, "I understand." We planned for 6 days. 6 days of logistics and backup routes and contingencies and arguments. Arguments about timing, about resources, about what we'd do with Mara once she was out of the facility, about whether any of this was actually feasible. Yusuf is good at logistics, but he's also good at identifying every possible way something can go wrong. And for 4 of those 6 days, every time I thought we had a plan, he'd find 3 new things that could go wrong with it. But on the evening of the 6th day, we had something. Not a perfect plan, there's no such thing, but a workable one. A route, a cover, a window of time, 3 exits, a vehicle, a safe house, a network contact who could provide medical support if needed. We were going in on day 7. That night, sitting alone in my apartment with the plan mapped out in my head, and the familiar pre-action quiet settling over me, I thought about something Yusuf had said during the planning sessions. "The network has been monitoring the energy readings near her cell more closely for the last 3 days, he'd told me. Whatever the Velari interrogator has been doing, the resonance tap, the repeated attempts, it seems to be having an effect, just not the one he intended." "What kind of effect?" I'd asked. Yusuf had hesitated. "The readings are getting stronger, not from his equipment, from her, like his attempts to access her are, stimulating something, waking something up." I thought about that now, in the quiet of my apartment. She was trying to force something to happen, I'd thought when I first saw her. Maybe, I thought now, she didn't need to force it. Maybe she just needed someone to try hard enough to unlock it for her. Part 2. What WAKES in the dark. Day 7. 400 hours. The streets of Administrative Zone 7 were quiet in the way that occupied cities are quiet, not peaceful, not relaxed, but suspended, held breath. The Velari night patrols moved in their regular patterns, amber eyes scanning, efficient and systematic, covering the same routes they always covered. That predictability was their weakness. Humans adapt. Humans improvise. Humans notice patterns and route around them. I had the patrol timing memorized to 40-second windows. Yusuf had 3 people in position. One at the external power junction 2 blocks from the facility, ready to trigger a localized brownout on command. One in a vehicle 4 streets east with medical supplies and a clear path to the safe house. And one, a young woman named Petra, who would be my partner inside the building. I'd worked with Petra twice before. She was quiet and precise, and she had a gift for appearing completely unremarkable. She could stand in the middle of a room full of Velari, and not a single one of them would look at her twice, because she somehow made herself occupy space in a way that simply didn't register as interesting. It was a talent I respected enormously. We went in through the maintenance access on the building's west face at 417. The facility at night was different from the facility during maintenance hours. Quieter, most of the administrative functions wound down after the second shift rotation, but more alert in specific places. The Velari didn't need as much sleep as humans, and the security infrastructure on the sub-level was staffed and active through the night cycle. We'd mapped the staffing pattern over 3 weeks of observation. 4 enforcers on the sub-level during night hours. 2 at the main checkpoint, 1 doing roving patrol, 1 stationed near the holding cells. The roving patrol was the variable. Petra handled it. I don't know exactly how. I was already moving toward the cell block by the time she did whatever she did. But when I looked back from the corridor junction, the patrol enforcer was standing at the far end of the sublevel with his attention completely fixed on something near the ceiling, which is where Velari instinctively look when they perceive a sound or motion, and Petra was gone. I moved. The holding cell area was down a short corridor, behind a security door that used a biometric scan, specifically, a resonance scan of the Velari bioelectrical field, which was how most of their security systems worked, effective against humans and most other species they'd encountered. But we'd spent 2 years reverse engineering a Velari resonance emitter from salvaged components, and the device I carried in the inner pocket of my maintenance jacket could produce a passable imitation of the right signature. Passable, not perfect. We had maybe a 12-second window between when the door read the signal and when the monitoring system would flag it as anomalous. I pressed the emitter to the scanner plate and counted. 1, 2, 3. The door opened. I was through and into the corridor beyond before the count reached 6. There were 4 cells in the block, 3 empty, 1 occupied. I stopped outside her cell. She was awake. Of course she was awake. She was in the same position she'd been in every time I saw her, sitting upright, hands flat, that terrible focus turned inward. But something was different about her tonight. The air around her felt different. That's the only way I can describe it. Like the air had a texture it didn't normally have, a subtle pressure or vibration that I was picking up through my skin rather than hearing or seeing. Like standing near high-voltage equipment when it's running at capacity. And her eyes, when she finally looked up at me, had something in them that hadn't been there before. Not fear, not surprise. Light. Not literal light, not yet. But something luminous was building behind her irises, like a fire being lit from a very deep place, just beginning to get enough fuel to really take hold. "You're not Velari," she said. Her voice was low and controlled and completely, unnervingly calm for someone who'd been in a detention cell for nearly 3 weeks. "No," I said, "I'm with the network, I'm getting you out." She looked at me for a long moment, assessing. Then she stood up in one smooth, unhurried movement, like she'd been sitting in a comfortable chair rather than a detention cell for weeks, and said, "How long do we have?" "Minutes," I said. "We need to go now." She nodded once. I ran the emitter over the cell lock. The door slid open. She stepped out, and I noticed immediately that she moved differently than I'd expected. She'd been sitting still for so long that I'd unconsciously expected her to be stiff, clumsy, needing a moment to find her legs. But she stepped out of that cell with the precise, economical movement of someone who had spent the last 3 weeks not wasting any energy, who had been conserving everything, storing it up for exactly this moment. We moved. We were almost to the security door at the end of the corridor when the roving patrol came back. He wasn't supposed to be back for another 4 minutes. That's the problem with patterns, they're reliable until they aren't, and when they break at the worst possible moment. The enforcer came around the corner at the end of the corridor and stopped. He saw us immediately. The amber glow of his eyes shifted, intensified, the Velari equivalent of going on high alert, and his upper 2 arms moved toward the weapon at his hip with a speed that was genuinely impressive. I was reaching for the only thing I had, a localized disruption device, effective at close range but not close enough yet, when Mara stepped in front of me. She stepped in front of me and raised her right hand. I don't know what I expected to happen. I think some part of me expected her to try to talk to him, or bluff, or stall, some human response to a bad situation. The mind goes to familiar things under pressure. What happened was not familiar. The air between Mara's outstretched hand and the Velari enforcer compressed. That's the only word for it. I felt it as a physical sensation, a pulse, not of sound but of something else, something that moved through the air like sound but wasn't, that I felt in my chest and my teeth and the hollow of my ears. Like standing next to a speaker when a subwoofer hits a bass note so low it's below human hearing but your whole body registers it anyway. The enforcer stopped. Not because he'd been hit, not because he'd been physically restrained. He stopped the way a machine stops when its power cuts. Instantly, completely, every motion arrested simultaneously. He stood there with his arms still mid-reach toward his weapon, frozen, his amber eyes still glowing but no longer shifting, just stopped. Mara lowered her hand. The pulse dissipated, the strange pressure in the air eased. I stood there for approximately 3 full seconds doing nothing, which is 3 seconds I did not have. Then Mara turned to me and said calmly, "That won't hold him long, maybe 90 seconds, we should move." I moved. We made it to the maintenance access. Petra was already there, appearing out of what seemed like nothing, falling into step beside us without comment on the speed of our exit or the look on my face. Petra is good at not commenting on things. We were out of the building by 4:49. The vehicle was where it was supposed to be. The route was clear. We drove east through the silent streets of Administrative Zone 7, while the city held its breath around us, and I kept checking the mirrors, expecting pursuit, expecting alarm signals, expecting the kind of organized Velari response that I knew they were capable of when sufficiently motivated. Nothing followed us. Not immediately. Mara sat in the back seat and was completely silent for the first 10 minutes, not the stunned silence of someone processing trauma or shock, the quiet of someone who has a lot to think about and is thinking it. When she finally spoke, she looked at me in the rearview mirror and said, "You knew the signal code." "Yes," I said. "From who?" "The network. I'm one of Yusuf's people." She was quiet for a moment. My mother spoke about someone she called Yusuf. She said if anything happened to her, if I needed help, to find a way to reach someone called Yusuf. "Did she tell you how to reach him?" "She didn't need to," Mara said. "By the time I needed to reach him, I already knew the signal." I glanced at her in the mirror. "How?" The faintest expression crossed her face, not quite a smile, not quite sadness, something in between. "My mother didn't teach me things the way most people teach things," she said. "She was different in how she communicated. She figured out a long time ago that some kinds of knowledge can't survive being written down or spoken aloud. The Velari can intercept all of that, everything digital, everything sonic, everything electromagnetic. So she found another way." I waited. "She taught me things in my sleep," Mara said quietly. "Not like learning, not like studying. More like she would sit with me while I was sleeping and send things, images, patterns. Information encoded in a form the Velthari couldn't detect because they don't know it exists. She paused. I don't know if she knew she could do it at first. I think she discovered it by accident and then she spent years refining it. By the time she died, she'd gotten very precise, very efficient. I was quiet for a moment, driving through empty streets. What did she send you? Mara looked out the window. Everything, she said. Everything she'd learned, everything she'd figured out. And something else. She turned back to the mirror, and even in the dim light of the vehicle interior, I could see that luminous quality in her eyes that I'd noticed in the cell. She sent me herself, little pieces of herself, the way she thought, the patterns her mind used to work through problems. She touched her own temple lightly with 2 fingers. She's still in there, somewhere. The safe house was a basement apartment in a building that had, before the Velthari arrival, been a small hotel. Now it was residential, 12 families crammed into rooms that used to be single-occupancy accommodation, and the basement had been quietly converted over the years into a network hub that didn't officially exist. Yusuf was there when we arrived. I'd worked with Yusuf for 6 years, and I knew him better than almost anyone in my life. He was a compact man, mid-50s, Jordanian by background, who had the kind of calm that comes not from the absence of fear, but from the practiced management of it. He'd been running the network since the 3rd year of the occupation, and everything about him, his posture, his voice, the way his eyes moved when he was thinking spoke of someone who had lived for a very long time in the gap between catastrophe and survival, and had learned to be comfortable there. He was not comfortable when Mara walked in. He stood up when we came through the door, which he didn't usually do. He stood up and he looked at her, and something moved across his face that I'd never seen there before, something that wasn't quite recognition, because I don't think he'd ever met her in person, but wasn't quite surprised either. More like confirmation. Like he'd been waiting for something and here it was, and it was both what he'd expected and more than he'd expected simultaneously. Mara Voss, he said. Yusuf, she said, my mother said I could trust you. I hope she was right, he said, with an honesty that I appreciated. She looked around the room, the maps on the walls, the network equipment in the corner, the 3 other network people who'd been there when we arrived, and were now doing that thing that humans do when something significant is happening, and they're not sure if they should watch or look away. She took it all in with that same quiet, assessing quality. I need to tell you some things, she said, and then I need your help with something. Tell me, Yusuf said. She sat down at the table and she told him. I won't give you every detail of what she said over the next 2 hours, because some of it was technical in ways that I'm not equipped to accurately reproduce, and because some of it was personal in ways that were hers and shouldn't be mine to repeat at length. But I'll tell you the shape of it. Alina Voss had spent her last years piecing together something that the Velthari had never intended humans to understand. She'd started from publicly available Velthari scientific documents, the ones released to human researchers as part of the collaboration programs, and found patterns in the data that didn't add up, gaps where there should be information, consistent omissions across multiple documents from multiple Velthari researchers. The specific shape of what they were hiding is sometimes as informative as the thing itself. What they were hiding, Alina had concluded, was this. When the Velthari first surveyed Earth, decades before they arrived remotely, through instruments humans didn't know existed, they found something in the human genome that they'd never encountered in any other species in their extensive galactic catalogs. Not a capability, not an evolved trait, an architecture. A complex, dormant biological structure that appeared, based on Velthari theoretical models, to be designed. Not evolved. Designed. Someone had built something into the human genome, into the human neurological architecture, into what Alina called the human bioelectrical field, the complex of electromagnetic phenomena generated by the living human body, and that something was waiting, dormant. Like hardware waiting for software, like a lock waiting for a key. The Velthari had been studying this for decades before they arrived. They had come to Earth not to conquer it, not in any sense they understood as conquest, but to observe, to monitor, to be present when the architecture activated so they could control what happened next, so they could be the key. Because what Alina had pieced together was that the architecture, when activated, would produce capabilities in the individual human in whom it activated that were, the word she'd used in the documentation she'd hidden in Mara's memory, transformative. Not just for that person, for the species. And potentially for the balance of power in a galactic civilization, where the Velthari had been the dominant force for 300 years. The Velthari weren't afraid of humans. They were afraid of what humans were going to become. And they intended to control the activation, to be present for it, to direct it, to ensure that when this latent architecture in the human genome finally came online, it came online in a controlled environment under Velthari supervision, producing capabilities that the Velthari could study, contain, and ultimately exploit. Alina had identified her daughter as the individual in whom the architecture was closest to activation. And so she'd done the only thing she could do. She'd spent her last years not trying to trigger the activation, not trying to speed it up, but trying to prepare Mara for what was coming, filling her mind with everything she knew, encoding it in a way the Velthari couldn't detect or extract. And then she died, and the Velthari had come for Mara. And the Class 4 interrogator, the librarian, had spent 3 weeks trying to extract what Alina had hidden in Mara's mind. 3 weeks of resonance tap attempts that didn't work the way they were supposed to, because the information Alina had encoded wasn't stored the way information was supposed to be stored. It was more integrated than that, more structural. He wasn't accessing my memories, Mara said near the end of her account, her voice level and clear. He was trying to access my mother, and she's not stored as data, she's stored as architecture. She became part of the way I think, part of the way I process information. He couldn't pull her out without pulling me apart. Silence in the room. And the resonance tap attempts, Yusuf said slowly. They were waking something up. Yes, Mara said. Every time he tried to push through the resonance barrier, he was stimulating the bioelectrical structures, activating more of the architecture than had been active before. She looked down at her hands. By the time you got me out of there, the process was approximately 30% complete. Complete, I said. Complete meaning? Meaning activated, she said. Meaning whatever this architecture is built to do, whatever whoever built it intended it to do, it was nearly a third of the way to doing it. And now, Yusuf asked. She looked at her hands for a long moment. Then slowly, without visible effort, without any of the focused straining I'd seen in the cell, she held her right hand palm up on the table. Above her palm, the air changed. The same texture I'd felt in the corridor, but gentler, more controlled. And then, in the space above her hand, approximately 6 inches above her skin, something appeared that I am still not able to fully describe accurately. It was light, but not light the way a flame is light or a bulb is light. It was organized light, structured, geometrically precise, forming and reforming in patterns that were almost but not quite fractal. And it had a sound, or something that my brain interpreted as sound even though I couldn't identify where it was coming from, a very deep, very complex tone that sat below the threshold of hearing, but above the threshold of feeling. She held it there for a few seconds. Then she closed her hand, and it was gone. 34%, she said quietly, give or take.